worked. So, hello everyone. Long time no see for the people who have been coming or used to come to live streams, but not to the physical classes or alternative. Pardon?
I'm not seeing you broadcasting.
Are you now?
Yes.
Sweet. So, yeah, technical errors. I have a technical crew now. This is amazing. It's cool. So, yeah. Tonight we're going to look at the 1895 Infantry Sword Exercise. Part of my ongoing effort to get some coverage of standard British military fencing manuals from the Victorian period. Year before last, like in the before times, well, actually during COVID, we looked at the method of William II in the standard military, four-cut military system, and now we're going to look at the manual that replaced it, which is just referred to as the 1895 Infantry Sword Exercise. It's generally not attributed to a particular person, mostly because it was written by a committee, and even the people who are most involved in writing the physical wording weren't the people who developed the fencing, which is what makes this really, really fascinating. In that the 1895 is based off the fencing method of an Italian fencing master by the name of Masiello, whose first name I've completely forgotten because that's what's going on here now. But yeah, so this was a very standard, very common system in Italy at the time. It then went on to become the standard method for the British Army. I should be clear, it was never taken up by the Navy. Like, one of the comments you can make about this is that it did spread into the civilian fencing world, and that there are civilian fencing manuals that are essentially slightly upgraded versions of this manual, but it was never taken on by the Navy. It had only a nominal impact in the civilian fencing world, but yeah, it was it was certainly very significant at the time, and it drew a lot of controversy. And I should be clear, like, unlike, say, Tui's method, which is mostly just criticised, or at least very least started to be criticised when you get into the 1870s and 1880s. This was really quite heavily criticised at the beginning, and then I don't know. It's a weird one because this was written about 20 years before World War I and the end of swords as a military weapon. The history of it is actually really, really cool and interesting, and as much as I'm going to get into the technique a bit, something I should specify is that there's no way I can cover the entire manual in, sort of the hour or so that I'm going to be live streaming, maybe hour and a half, just because it is a really big and detailed manual and there is a lot to it. So there's a lot of things which I'm going to be summarizing. Incidentally, if you want a full breakdown, and especially a full breakdown from someone who is knows a lot more about this than me, there's actually going to be a workshop on Northern Italian sabre at the Melbourne Cell, I think next week. What is it? It is 5th of March. And as an extension of that, I'm not an expert in the system. It's kind of outside what I normally do. So what I normally do is British-based systems, particularly those by Alfred Hutton, who incidentally was one of the major critics of this of the 1895. But also people like John Musgrave Waite and R.G. Allenson Wynne. So in a funny way, like, my background and my biases are probably more akin to the people criticizing the manual than to the people who than to the manual itself. But within that, I think the manual is pretty cool. Like, it's got a lot going for it, and I think in a lot of ways it's very compelling. Its only real substantive weakness is, if anything, poor wording, and that there's some bits of it where I had to go to other manuals that cover the same material, like early translations of Masiello's work, to kind of work out what it was trying to tell me to do. And there's some bits that it doesn't explain properly. And this is actually a criticism I've seen from people who practice Italian sabre, where they're very skeptical about how involved in the actual writing Masiello was, whereas in period, generally this manual is primarily credited to a guy named Colonel Malcolm Fox. I pronounce his title, his name, who was the head of the British Military Academy for Gymnastics at Aldershot. So if I talk about Aldershot, it's kind of like the British equivalent of Jonesville at the time, but certainly not as successful at developing fencing, and had a lot of other focuses other than fencing. And what's really interesting about Colonel Malcolm Fox himself is, as much as he was famous as a sportsman, he was well regarded as being a very, very good athlete. He wasn't a fencer, and he wasn't a fencing instructor. He did have the distinction of having used his sword in combat. When he'd been serving, he'd actually been involved in taking a trench in a battle in Egypt with cold steel, so bayonets and swords, and being an officer. He actually used his sword to kill two people before being wounded in the leg. So, sort of the sort of person that you'd expect to see writing a manual, to be involved in that. But at the same time, he seems broadly disconnected from what's going on in the British fencing scene at the time. And Britain was kind of coming out of a very, very bad century in terms of swordsmanship. So in Britain, sword fighting had been incredibly popular in the 18th century and into the early 19th century. And then with the decline of single stick as a spectator sport, interest in sword fighting waned. And then towards the end of the century, with not just imperialism, but also interest in the Middle Ages, and also, honestly, the efforts of Alfred Hutton, interest in fencing had started to come back, but faced a lot of impediments, one of which was a lack of national school. But to get into the history of the system itself, so we first start to see Masiello's fencing in Britain in 1889. So Masiello published his own manual in 1887 in Italy, and then we see a translation of it by a guy named Francis Vere-Wright, who was at that time currently serving British soldier, who had also actually served in the Italian Wars of Unification. Like, he'd fought in the Italian Wars of Unification, which is how he learnt the system or got involved in Italian fencing. He published a translation, and this translation actually had support from the then Duke of Cambridge, Prince George, who was also Commander-in-Chief of the military, which is no small feat, because reputedly the Duke of Cambridge was the reason why the British military was so incredibly conservative about upgrading its doctrines at the time. So when you hear about how this or that bayonet fencing manual was rejected by the army, basically the reason why is because the Commander-in-Chief of the military was literally quoted as saying that change is something that you do when you're forced to and no earlier. And so he just kind of rejected everything off the bat. Was quite famous for being very, very stubborn about introducing new methods, but he did really, really like Francis Vere-Wright's translation of Masiello's manual, even to the extent where the manual was actually dedicated to him. He actually gave it a degree of royal patronage, which I suspect is why it's the starting point of Masiello's method being adopted by the British military. From there, we actually hear about it being practiced in Aldershot. We hear about things being done at Aldershot, through sort of the next 6 years and lead up to the publication of the manual. So in 1892, the British government actually brought out a group of Italian fencing masters and brought them on a tour, specifically with a mind to updating British fencing using the Italian method. This, was kind of a sensation in Britain. There's a bit of interest in the press. And these fencing masters were also hosted by Colonel Malcolm Fox, who was obviously dealing with them very directly at this point, so he was already talking to them. But also at a different point in 1892, Alfred Hutton gave a presentation to a committee of the top-ranking military brass. And while Colonel Malcolm Fox couldn't be there himself, he did write a letter to be read out by a friend of his. Mick's asking, so he actually killed 2 guys with his sword. Swords were still being used in combat in the Victorian period. As far as the British military is concerned, the sword is still a weapon in use. But Colonel Fox sent this letter to be read out by a friend of his. And one of the things he complains about is that Alfred Hutton is criticising British military sword play without actually engaging in the developments that are happening at Aldershot himself. And is, and that rather than, complaining and trying to do things himself, he should come and help out at Eldershot, or he should essentially invest more in what Colonel Fox is doing. Unfortunately, as part, because we've got a record of the entire discourse, several of the other top brass basically complain that Eldershot has not yet produced a new manual, and say that they agree with Hutton that the British military fencing coming out of Eldershot is not really sufficient. And there was a lot of criticism of Eldershot for not having produced anything in the period. But we do know that things were happening. So Masiello himself actually came over to Britain the following year in 1893, where he was said to be teaching the British cavalry sword fighting, and presumably at the time also consulting with Colonel Malcolm Fox and the other officers at Eldershot who were basically putting together this manual. I get the sense that part of why it took them so long, this manual basically took about 6 years, nearly 6 years to write, was that they were learning the system themselves. So this wasn't something that they were writing from their own fencing expertise. They were completely learning a very new system in order to introduce it. Ultimately, the system was introduced in 1895, where it was incredibly divisive. So we've got a lot of record of people, of newspapers publishing criticisms and then publishing articles saying, we acknowledge that this manual has a lot of fans and a lot of defenders, and that there's actually there were a lot of people who really, really liked it. There's also a lot of people who really didn't like it, and this actually generated a lot of discussion about sword fighting, and particularly military sword fighting at the time. So you get responses from a guy named Colonel Vellens, Cosgrove, Tonachi, actually wrote a full article while he was serving on the northern frontier of British holdings in India, and had been fighting, using his sword there. And he said that basically this method is not adequate for what we're doing. It doesn't actually train British soldiers to fight with fight sword against sword, and isn't adequately preparing them for combat. But at the same time, this was, and actually technically I think still is, the standard doctrine of the British military. Although that said, this is again written about 20 years before World War I happens and the sword ceases to be a combative weapon. What's really interesting about the manual is it's actually part of a whole gymnastic program. So it's not just a manual sword fighting, it's kind of came as part of a regime of physical training. And this is a model of fencing that was adopted on the continent. But a lot of the objections and a lot of things, we'll be talking about when we get into the issue, or I don't know, alleged issues with it. I don't want to evaluate whether or not this is a good manual. I don't think it's appropriate for modern people to turn around and say, okay, well, in hindsight, a mistake was made, or in hindsight, this was an excellent idea. Especially when those opinions would overrule the opinions of people back during the period. And so I want to kind of certainly see where the people writing the manual were coming from, but also see where the critics were coming from. And my goal with this is not to come up with some kind of console wars answer, so much as just try to actually understand what's going on in terms of fencing in Britain at the time, and kind of go from there. But yeah, what's really interesting is a lot of the objections at the time were ultimately mitigated because this system came as part of a whole system of physical education and gymnastics training, fitness training, rather than just as a system of swording, which I find really interesting, because one of the criticisms of it is that it felt like the British Army had gone to be doing purely sabre fencing, whereas before they'd been doing both foil and sabre as weapons, which I find kind of interesting that kind of shift. But again, so yeah. Anyway, let's get into looking at the manual. So I'm going to need a Jacob of some kind to help me out. So my kingdom for a Jacob. If there's a Jacob. But I have no kingdom. Sorry. But yeah, so let's get into it and start looking. Grab swords and they're here. You were physically on the couch when I put those things. And yeah, talk and sort of start getting through the system and what it represents. And again, I do want to preface this by saying this is not a system I have a lot of experience in. I started looking into this like a bit over a month ago. And as much as I have a background in historical fencing, it's looking at British systems that are really, really different in terms of their sensibility. And like, and you see that in a lot of the criticisms where the system will say, tell you to disengage from the shoulder, and then someone will write back, oh no, you should be disengaging from the wrist. And yeah, it's kind of interesting. Also, if you do have any comments, just chuck them down now. Just because I will get to them eventually. Just please actually give some context, because I might talk, like, you might respond to something I say and it'll be like 5 minutes before I can get to it. And if I don't know the context, I will probably answer very, very badly. But,
Or of course, instead of saying you should disengage from the wrist, they might just say, well, I don't think we need to comment why this is wrong, and move on.
yes. This one of the things you do see with this is it's like proper internet levels of just, it's very much angry internet boy. Like, this is, well, I think the personalities of the, honestly, men involved kind of leads them to being a bit bullheaded on all parts. And you see that from all ends. These are, I don't think these people would have been necessarily very capable of cooperating once they saw themselves in opposition. But again, I don't necessarily want to speculate on the personalities of people who, like lived however long ago. Most of them would have died over 100 years ago. So yeah. Cool. So one of the distinctive things about the system is the guard. So are you able to? Okay, cool. So the stance is a lot wider and a lot lower than is traditional in sorts of fencing that's been done in Britain at the time, whereas most British fencing is done this kind of stance. The 1895 has a much deeper, lower stance, and this is specifically to enable a much longer lunge. The sword is held basically flat, palm flat, so just palm down, and fully extended. What gets referred to as second or second, but is second in Italian numbering, which it's really interesting that like this manual makes absolutely no reference to French fencing terminology at all, in spite of that being what was the dominant system of fencing or dominant system of terminology in Britain at the time. You have this really long pointy guard. Fencing with it over the past month, a lot of people said they find it really intimidating to have a sword like stuck out right at them. And this guard was, of course, very, very criticised for putting undue stress on the arm and potentially actually leading to what they term they say lawn tennis elbow, basically tennis elbow or RSI. So occasionally hear that particularly Hutton thinks extended guards unduly wear out the arm. He's not saying that they're overly tiring, you can't hold them for very long. What he's saying is that they increase the chance of injury, which, when you're a fencer, hobby fencer is probably not that significant. You can just take a week off. In military, injury prevention is actually quite important because, if you're fencing for practice and you give yourself RSI whilst you're either training or even while you're serving, that's you out of action or that's a soldier at reduced capacity for an amount of time. So this was a reasonable consideration. And this also was one that was medically supported at the time. A lot of doctors wrote in The Lancet, for example, which is was actually a medical journal that's still around today, which is kind of cool, about fencing and about the strain it put on the body. And yeah, this was actually a major criticism that this was going to cause undue strain and therefore undue injury to the arm for basically needing to hold it extended for long periods of time. What's interesting is this criticism then got mitigated basically by Colonel Fox demonstrating a whole bunch of gymnastic exercises that were done with the teaching of the system that basically would support the arm, build up strength, and even the doctors who had previously criticised it at the time are like, actually, this is really good. This is going to mitigate all of our concerns, and a lot of the physiological concerns about the guard were basically mitigated, in spite of having been very, very major concerns and very majorly discussed in the fencing community over the previous 10 years. So you have the guard. The next thing that the manual goes on to talk about is distance, and the distance one is interesting. So when I said that there was an earlier translation of Masiello's work, I've kind of had to use that a lot because there are some things that the manual legitimately just does explain badly. One of which is its section on distance. The 1895 says there are 3 different distances. There is correct distance, being too far, or being too close. And that's all it says.
Very helpful.
Yeah. It is, well, yeah. It's interesting when you start to read the other, also later translations. There's actually, this is one of the things that's corrected in a reprint of the manual from a year later, from 1896. So there's obviously some recognition at the time that there were problems, at least, with the manual. I think it's also important to remember that there's a distinction between problems with the manual, what the 1895 manual says, and what is a criticism of Masiello's method. And in a lot of cases, it's mainly criticisms of the former rather than the latter that you see. So the distance thing is kind of interesting because so much of the system actually rests on distance. So we're going to need to get shorter swords. This is going to be a constant theme where I constantly say, oh yeah, this thing about distance that we can't really show because my flat just isn't big enough. Which interestingly enough I think that was actually a criticism, was that the 1895 wasn't great in oppressive combat because you're very, very close. But distance is actually super important to getting this to work. This is the thing that I've noticed fencing with it. I need to be at a very long lungy distance. There's a lot of vulnerabilities with being counter hit that can happen if you stand at what would be a normal sort of Hutton distance. If we start here with a normal fence. There's a lot of things that you just can't do because you get counter hit, but you can mitigate that by just starting at the correct distance, which Via Wright defines as the full distance of a lunge, or don't be able to stand at the full distance of a lunge where you would hit your opponent with the top third of your blade. So for me, that is slightly, move some stuff, probably slightly further than the distance.
Press myself against the wall, maybe.
Yeah, so if I'm here, so this is probably about correct distance correct distance for me. Jacob could probably come a little bit closer.
It's not fine.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, cool. But yeah, that's kind of a major thing about it, and this is a thing I've noticed also fencing people who do Italian sabre, is distance management becomes a really major battleground, more so than when I fence people who are also doing Hutton systems like me, who can get to their preferred distance to fence from makes such a huge difference in who's actually going to win. And I think that's a significant thing, but I also think it's important to note that a lot of the criticisms that are made of this method don't really take that into account. There's a lot of criticisms of things that will be too easily counter hit, or unlikely land properly, that don't take into account that, well, if you're standing far enough away that your opponent can't reach you, it's not really going to matter. Right, so next thing, I'll move my notebook over just so that I don't have to constantly stop. Plus I just like this book. It's rad. So next thing I go into is advances and retreats. And again, this is kind of, the advance and retreat is just your normal kind of move back and forth, wide and narrow. except the wording of the advance particularly is kind of fun, where it says basically you step forward until you're correct. This is something that was resounding. Well, what if the person is? Yeah. The Francis for Your Right manual actually goes into a bit more detail. Actually specifies that you only extend as long as you can, and then sometimes you'll have to do multiple steps. But the 1895 doesn't. It just says step as far as you need to get into distance, which, yeah, kind of an interesting description. And then the retreat is just a normally worded retreat. So it's kind of interesting in the way this is worded. And I do think this is a very good system. Just it is occasionally very poorly explained, but fairly standard footwork. It then gets into the next gloriously controversial thing in the system, which is the leaning lunge. So, lunge, can you be a type? So lunge in the system, and I'm very bad at this. One thing I will say for lunge is you really want to do a lot of core strength exercise to do it well. And I think part of why this system was so heavily coupled with gymnastics exercise is it does require a greater degree of athleticism than some other contemporary systems. That's not necessarily an indictment, because we should probably be doing fitness stuff with our training anyway, but just it does require it.
I do feel like I should be halfway down the corridor for this, but
maybe we'll see how we go. But the lunge is done on a very long lean, like you're actually leaning forward. And this was fairly controversial. So Hutton actually ended up Hutton was very critical of this, because what he says is that leaning lunges were in vogue in the 1860s in Britain, and then basically one of the innovations that sort of got Britain out of its dark age of fencing neglect was realizing that they were a bad idea. And while I don't think that they're innately a bad idea, I think it is very interesting that for Hutton, this was something that the meta of the fencing that he basically grew up doing, sort of did away with. This was a really big thing. But the criticism is basically that they're overcommitted, which
I do like that he raises both one perfectly good criticism and one very silly criticism. One is it takes a while to get back out of it. You're overcommitted. That's a fine criticism. The other one is if you teach people to do this on foot, they'll do it on horse and will definitely fall off their horse. I'm not sure about that one.
Yeah, I mean, I've never done cavalry stuff, so I don't know. But it is a very There's a lot of hyperbole and pettiness in the criticisms, and I think particularly with Hutton, there is an element that if it wasn't for the introduction of, or if it wasn't for the adoption of Masiello's method, it would have been him who would have developed the would have been developing the standard British method, because he was one of probably one of about three or four professional sword instructors, fencing instructors in Britain at the time. And I think, as far as I know, he was the only one who really put much focus on sabre. Two of the other instructors were imported French instructors, and something that even the French comment on is that sabre is not particularly well studied in France in the period. Actually, one of the top fencing instructors in France, Guy de la Saint-Maroux, sent his son to learn sabre in Italy, because he's like, well, sabre fencing is so much more developed in Italy, we might as well just adopt the Italian method in France as well. Which I think is kind of interesting, because the French and Italians actually had a massive rivalry over which school was better otherwise, but only for not for sabre, which curious.
In case anyone in the audience hasn't done Hutton, do you want to very quickly demonstrate the difference between a leaning lunge and...
Yeah, so a standard one. So Hutton's lunge is done with basically 2 or 4 foot widths distance and an upright posture, as opposed to leaning forward. Yeah. So, of course, the leaning lunge has a huge advantage in terms of reach, which, when you're playing a long-range game, is actually super necessary and useful. So yeah, I'm not going to make a judgment call, and if I did, I'd honestly say that it's fine. Just make sure you know what you're trying to do with the thing.
Both have their advantages and drawbacks.
Yeah, but yeah, this is a big feature of the system. We then get into the other footwork. So there's a reverse lunge and a jump. And if this goes back to what I was saying about distance and control distance before. The only other footwork other than kind of the forward lunge is basically to get back and to retreat really quickly. So I'm going to come to the middle of the ball. Let's say I find myself, way too close to my opponent. One of the things I can do is a jump, is jump back, which I think is that, based on the wording of mostly the ride. The problem is in the manual, the way it describes it is you meant to lift both feet off the ground and then move your lead foot to behind your back foot and your back foot back, and your back foot back about an equal distance. Which
there is a lot of hovering involved.
Maybe there's an expectation of limitation, or my suspicion is it's just, again, badly worded. The actual move is pretty cool. I was actually doing fencing earlier today. I actually got this to work, which was good because otherwise my opponent was running me down something chronic. But it's a really, really cool way to just basically launch yourself back.
And the thing that makes it especially confusing in the wording is that it pretty much explicitly says that your lead foot should go behind your back foot.
Yeah.
And it's just I don't know how you can do that. Even if I ignore the parts about both feet being off the ground at the same time, that kind of implies which is not a very stable move.
Yeah. It's weirdly worded, but looking at supplementary material, you can see what they're trying to communicate. It's just weird wording. But what's cool about it is that it gives you a very, very quick way to retreat. So particularly if you're fencing someone who does a different fencing system and just wants to be closer, because you might be, say, out of their lunge distance otherwise and able to control initiative and rain down hell on them without being able to do much about it, unless they come closer. If they do manage to come closer in a way that you can't just deal with by taking a step back, having it as an option is really, really cool.
If you lunge in and they parry while stepping forwards, you really want to get the hell out of there.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's cool. I like it, but just bad wording is going to be a common theme of this. And then the other one that they have is a reverse lunge, which I've completely forgotten the wording for this, which is probably for the best because that was also very heavily criticised. The exact same premise is I go to a full lunge position and then come back to guard. And I apologise if I go to the guards that like a more British system guard, because that's what I'm familiar with. I will try to do the guard from the book, but if I'm not paying attention, I will make mistakes. That's basically just another method of getting out. It's explicitly said in the manual that it's a really good way to escape if your opponent is too close. Is that the one where you're meant to move both feet back at once? Or
No, I think Hutton's criticism of that one was just it was explained with a lot of extraneous movement.
Yeah.
He talks about after taking a step back, there's a stamp with the front foot.
Yeah, that's actually just
feels a bit like Hutton being petty.
I don't know. Hutton is being petty in general, but that criticism of all the extraneous detail is really interesting. A big feature of the manual is it explains things in a lot of very specific detail. It basically tries to micromanage you into being a good fencer. The section on feints is quite long, especially compared to other manuals from the period that just say, here's how to feint. You know, here's like they might have like a few drills where you try it out, or you try out all the feints. Or they might just say, just go feint at someone and see what they do. But the 1895 goes into a lot of detail about every possible feint you could do with the techniques from the system. And it goes into a lot of detail about how to do everything. It's really interesting how much it contrasts with Hutton's pedagogy, where Hutton is very general and he kind of, like, he writes in a way where he wants the reader to fill in the gaps. He makes very strong use of what we now call zones of proximal development. Whereas the 1895 is very specific about you do this and then you do this. It's very, very procedural, which, yeah, I think is kind of why you get the extraneous detail. Like, even because they talk about like which muscles to tense and stuff. It's like, yeah, I mean,
Well, they do seem to swap, in terms when they're talking about like which muscles to tense, they do seem to swap between being quite precise and then also being quite colloquial. Like, we'll occasionally say, tense all the muscles in your leg, to which Hutton is like,
or
like this. Yeah, or like this.
yeah, it's an odd one. It's really odd. It's just, yeah, it's a really odd stuff. Yeah, it then goes on. It then goes on to discuss parries, which is also interesting from a pedagogy perspective. Is one of the criticisms is, why are they discussing parries before they discuss attacks? Like, I think it's everyone's just like, why? How are people going to learn how to parry if they don't know what an attack is? Like, well, they're just going to imagine what the attack is. But it does go on to teach them, and the parries are really super interesting. So I'm going to see if I can screen share the manual itself.
And honestly, I personally prefer parries being taught before attacks. Because if you teach attacks, you kind of, parries then get taught with the assumption that someone is doing your system and going to attack you in a way that you're expecting.
Mm.
If you just teach like anything coming over here, parry this way, I feel like it gives you a bit more of a flexible mindset.
Yeah, potentially. Potentially, I should probably warn people that there is a lot of muscular men in speedos in this manual.
Oh no, I hate this.
So if you have any issues with someone who looks like the sort of dude who put workout pictures on the Grinder profile, then avert your eyes. So this is the first parry. I'm mostly showing the parry plates because I keep forgetting the numbers. But this is a parry to the high hand side. It looks mostly like the parry of prime that you get in, any fencing system that uses French terminology. We then have, we then move on to the second parry, which looks vaguely like the parry of second. We then get the third parry, which kind of like Tia's. It's the numbering, and this is kind of odd. And then, fourth parry, fifth parry, and then sixth parry. Yeah, sort of mostly done with the arm extended, and just to get a sense of that. So if you attack me, I'm mostly trying to keep my arm extended and keep my opponent fairly far away. What's super interesting about these is all they really do is stop the attack. So I create a path for it to come down and stop at. Whereas in sort of the more traditional Anglo-French fencing, my parry, cut at me, it's easier. My parry actually displaces my opponent's sword a bit, either with a bit of a bump, or, go again, gently guides it to a position I want to counterattack from, but the parry both defends and displaces. In this system, as a contrast, the parry defends, and then the counterattack displaces. Because the counterattack displaces, and it's just, there's nothing significant about that other than that it's just interesting that that's how they approach to do it. but all the parries are done quite extended. And this is probably the thing I found hardest about actually introducing to the system, or like getting used to the system and guarding with it, because this is also the thing. It's the thing that's most different to what I've done. But I also found that if my opponent at longer range, really, really good, gave me a lot of control, gave me a lot of ability to kind of reach out and just find what my opponent was doing. If we get a bit closer, like if you come into, like even not let's say extension distance, but just out here and you like start throwing me, these actually get tangled up really easy. And it comes back to that whole distance management thing is long range, these parries are rad as heck. If your opponent starts getting closer or can pick their distance, they kind of struggle a bit. I've got a question, so I might quickly answer that. So, Mick has asked, how would you riposte from on the straight arm parry with any force? That is an excellent question because that's a question that got asked in the period. Which there are ways of doing it. But the whole manual, it's like over, not 100 pages, but there's a manual of over 100 pages that describes how to do it.
Thrusts are big more than that, I'm guessing.
Thrusts, big circle cuts, also just reposition your blade. So if you throw just my hand up from here, from here, I can do a circle cut. So I can just place and come in. I can just reposition and attack. And it's a little easier when you're not using actual or using a sword, something with sword length rather than cutlass length. I can just get control and then just come in with a thrust, particularly with attacks to the outside. So here.
Yeah, I'm not feeling happy right now.
Yeah, and the parry basically gets me that position. So there's a lot of things you can do, but
and especially because they're leading forward on the thrust.
Yeah,
I'm attacking and leading forward right into it.
Yeah. There's a lot of really cool sort of in-close engagement stuff where you just manipulate the opponent's sword so they run onto your point. It's a very, very different way of riposting, but there's nearly always a reposition of the sword, unless it's a thrust. In which case, you don't reposition your sword because, well, you do most of the time, but not always, depending on what kind of thrust you're doing. But yeah, there's a lot of really good parry options from that. It's just, there's a lot of time when you're going to have some kind of preparatory movement.
It's quite interesting as like, I don't know how thrust-centric the system seems, but I find like being able to parry extended and then kind of transition through a Hutton parry on the way through a Moulinet, like yes, kind of feels like you have more options of like, do I just control the center line and thrust?
Yeah.
Or do I go, actually I know I want to do a riposte.
Yeah, no, it has a lot, I think it definitely has a lot more options in terms of ways you can riposte, or things you can do.
It's quite rare if you're doing like a Hutton parry, it's quite rare that thrusting has any advantage over a cut because you're already kind of retracted, you already have a leverage advantage. Whether I cut at you or point and thrust at you is much for muchness, really. Whereas if you're parrying out here, a thrust is really good until you decide to go through a Moulinet.
Yeah.
And then a cut's really good.
Yeah, depending on. Yeah, so fair. No, and like, there's definitely a really or desire for stronger distinction, and there's a lot more versatility in play, which is interesting because the manual doesn't discuss parry or riposte in anywhere near as much detail as it does a whole bunch of other things. That's kind of one of the cool things about it is you can parry and then throw or choose your motion. You do it from the elbow. That's cool. Right, so the next thing the manual goes into is invites. It basically says these are a thing that exists, which is kind of sad because invites in manuals a bit more detailed about Masiello's stuff are really, really cool. They work kind of like guards do in that you're moving through the same parry positions, but rather than seeing it the way you traditionally see a guard, where the guard is to close a particular line, an invite is all about, or they're called invites because they make your opponent attack on a particular line. You close one line so your opponent attacks on another. The motions are pretty much the same as parries, at least in the 1895. But yeah, they're quite like, it's quite interesting from that perspective that, or the manual is like, okay, here's the thing you do to get your opponent to attack where you want them to, or somewhere specifically.
I can see the difference of perspective making a lot more sense, specifically because they're so far away from each other. Where the concept of an initial attack landing is less likely.
Yeah.
It's more about, it's less that I need to be prepared to close off this line immediately because something might come and hit me, so much as what do I want to funnel them into doing so that I can get an advantage in the fight.
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
So when you're standing this close, it's like, oh, okay, I need to close off a line so they can't hit me.
Which line are they most likely to attack? All right, close that one.
Yeah.
Slow everything down. Whereas, yeah, with this, it's, go, okay, open this line so they fall into my devious trap. Although there's actually a really cool distance component to this as well. So, all the stuff you see about invites gets criticized as, oh, this will only work on a beginner, only work on someone who is a noob. And I did kind of try invites with bouting, and it took me a while to kind of crack. But there's actually a big distance component where I might invite, so we might both be on guard. I might do something to invite, and I'll start coming in, I'll start pressing, I'll start moving a bit closer without actually necessarily doing anything. And that creates a really big temptation for you to go, on which point I can counter hit. And there's this wonderful distance component. It's almost like counter fighting, where you basically move and you basically create this temptation. It's also very useful. It's also very useful to think of in terms of when you are fencing, if you're going back to guard, specifically going to an invite, so that your opponent thinks that there's an option that you can then take advantage of. And yeah, I think it's kind of sad that this is not really discussed in the manual beyond this is a thing that exists, because when you look at the other manuals, like contemporary manuals that detail this in more detail, they're really cool, and I just think they're rad, and it's kind of sad they get neglected. Cool, but then from there we actually get into the attacks in the system. So the big one is the iconic circle cuts. These are first discussed essentially as a warm-up, as an exercise. So, guard, I might need to be the only one to do this just because of space requirements. And you just practice going through the big cut motions. And I apologize if I do any of these wrong to anyone who does 19th century Italian sabre. In my defense, there are a lot of people who do 19th century Italian sabre who have criticized the manual for explaining things badly. Although I've only been doing it for a month, so if you're so offended that I did it wrong, please make a video explaining it better.
Do they describe the big weight shift and the lean when you're cutting?
Yep. All the images actually show them all the way back. And yeah, this is partially just to build up the strength and get you into it. It builds up strength in your legs and through your core. This is actually quite important that you practice that to be able to do these well, because like I said, the system does require more athleticism than other contemporary fencing systems. Actually, even compared to most other fencing systems I can think of, say for some Italian Beatrice that's really bent over. But yeah, that's actually a big part of it. And at first they described them just as a standing exercise, and then they described doing more. And then later, after discussing other techniques, it's oh yeah, and you can do them on the lunge as well. And these are the circle cuts at the face, at the belly. Super interesting. The targeting thing is super interesting from a terminology perspective. So British fencing, even when they went to start using French terms for sabre stuff, when the language changed in the 1880s, still described cuts as numbered by angle. So 1, 2, 3. Whereas in both French and Italian fencing, they describe cuts by target. And yeah, this manual actually very fully just goes to cuts by target. Even though it's all entirely in English, all of the terminology are English words, there's no traditional British fencing terminology there. Yeah. Cool. So I'm going to comment, question? So Ed has asked, I know all of these movements are based on a person's sword end. Is there any commentary about being face to face or in the fields of battle? Short answer is no. This manual basically avoids, basically doesn't discuss any of that. It was actually criticised for not discussing what to do in a battle situation. Like one of the criticisms was it's just not very good if you're fighting someone with like a sword and buckler, which was very common, particularly in India and Afghanistan at the time. It just says nothing. And there was a lot of criticism that it wasn't really suitable for soldiers because it didn't actually train them for the scenarios that they dealt with.
Yeah, I think kind of three of Hutton's best criticisms are that the weapons are unlike what you use in war. The fact that you can't really target, or it doesn't teach targeting below the belt, and then also that it doesn't really teach if you get close to someone what to do. Yeah, like it's just there's absolutely nothing. Whereas, the leg one is really super interesting because that was a rule in sabre tournaments at the time in Italy and I think potentially also France. I don't know when that. I don't even know the exact history of it, but certainly was going on in Italy. That they just didn't target below the waist. Like the modern fencing thing of legs and off-target sabre was already in place, and this manual just doesn't say what to do, or like it doesn't teach how to target the leg. It doesn't teach how to defend the leg. And there are things in it that you can use for leg defenses. Most notably the jump, just skip back and just get your leg the hell out of the way. But yeah, that's not something explicitly in the manual. That's something that, I worked out to how to do. So I got frustrated getting hit in the leg a lot.
But I think you would have to defend mostly for distance because if anytime you're in these big extended things, the only other way you can defend your leg is by crouching and get your hand down in there.
And
as opposed to like a retracted card.
Yeah, sure. And well, also, if you're defending with distance, like if you, if I've got good control of distance and just got my sword out there,
that's like a terrible idea for me.
it's not quite as dire, but well,
I think realistically people are going to attack the legs on a parry.
Which is a thing that happens. But this was a big criticism that just wasn't training people to do things that they would need to do when they're actually fighting us, when they're actually in combat. So we have circle cuts. Next one we have is direct attacks or direct cuts, which are just normal. I move to a cutting position. The way they describe it is actually really great because they actually describe it in terms of what you do with your shoulder. So I can whip with my shoulder, and this is mostly how you do direct cuts in a lot of systems. Is you use the shoulder to generate power. But the manual is really, really explicit about it. Same sort of deal as circle cuts, except you do them basically from an extension and a slight reposition, rather than going through a full moulinet to then deliver a very powerful cut. Which, is normal sabre fencing. Don't have a lot of comments other than it's interesting that they went to describe them in terms of targets rather than in terms of cut angles. But that's the system. And then they describe thrusts. And as much as there's not a lot of description of point work. Point work's actually pretty important to the system. So you have three types of thrust, and I'm going to be typing this. So the first is a direct thrust, in which case it comes straight forward. You generally do this when your opponent isn't pointing their sword at you. And it's just, fairly normal. Next is by graze. And this is actually the one thing Hutton really praises about this system is he says that the attack by graze is generally one of the most powerful. What I do is I basically get control of my opponent's sword somehow. So you can see I'm actually displacing Jacob's sword a little. And then I just come in and I'm actually deflecting Jacob's sword off as I come in. And that's really, really cool. And then the final is by disengage. So if I want to attack my opponent on a different side, particularly if they've also very, very good for countering invitations, you disengage. And what's kind of interesting about this is I'm disengaging from the shoulder, whereas traditionally what you do is disengage from the wrist. I think that was the thing.
That was the one that Hutton goes something along the lines of, and we don't need to mention anything about this. Ridiculous. And then just doesn't say anything about why it's bad.
Just says it's self-evidently wrong. Internet comment sections.
Which is funny because his discussion of the cutover is
Yeah.
quite detailed and specific about why he doesn't like it.
Mm.
But his thing is just like, and then they disengage from the shoulder, and that's just obviously wrong. Let's not talk about that any further.
Yeah. But yeah, disengaging. What's interesting about it is, other than from the shoulder, is that it's done whilst you're in the lunge. So you've got a bit of timing. So if I start coming forward and you maybe go to parry, you actually come around. And yeah, I think this is really cool. But those are the three types, or generally three types of thrusts. One thing it does say is that you always thrust with your hand palm down. So you're coming in basically flat, always like that. So yeah, I kind of found interesting that I don't have like a palm up or a supinated thrust. It's always palm down.
They have a slightly bigger shell, don't they?
Yeah,
So it could be that they just think that this is enough cover even on the outside.
yeah, it's
Especially if your standard guard is already on your outside.
yeah,
It could just be that they don't think it's necessary to.
yeah. Also, actually, what was very normal in fencing, French fencing, was admittedly the opposite, where it's always held palm up, but you thrust the outside with the palm up and just point at the outside, and you thrust the inside with the palm up and just at a different angle. So it's kind of the opposite of that. Which, yeah, if you've got a massive shell, it's probably fine. Means you don't have to worry about turning your hand. So actually, can I see something? Yes, I'll just hold up. If I want to, if you point your sword at the shoulder, I want to displace this movement inwards, like just jerking my sword inwards, is quite strong because I'm able to use my chest.
Stronger than.
I don't. So compared to that,
Hmm.
this is structurally a bit better, but this is definitely in terms of actually getting some twist into it. I don't know, it's probably comparable, but it's still, I don't know, it's still fairly strong and felt like you can definitely do the job.
Especially if you don't want to, because this is stronger if you're willing to kind of turn it into a parry.
Yeah,
But if you want to keep your arm extended the whole time, it's probably much for muchness.
yeah, actually, just push against. Yeah, and another way. Yeah, I actually think palm down is a bit stronger. Especially you can get your back and get a lot more twist into it, or more easily. So yeah, that's probably why. From thrusts, they describe feints. You start with one attack and go to another. The manual takes dozens of pages describing every possible feint in a way that really could just be summarized as start one attack, change to another, try, and then just adding a few examples, which is more typical of how feints were communicated in the period. But yeah, like I'm not going to go into each one because we'll be here even more all night. The one I did really like, though, the one that I got to work a bit, was coming back for a full circle cut and then coming round, so it looks like I'm trying to deceive and get you to come in, and then going the other way. So just to show you that from the front, coming around, and that was rad, worked really, really well, and I liked it. Yeah, that's basically, feints can be summarized as start one attack and do another. Although they do combine, this is where it does mention the invites a bit, because there are times where it says from the invite of this position, which I imagine might have been a bit frustrating to someone reading the manual who didn't have the lesson invites that you would get in other discussions of the same material. But yeah, that's fates, and then you get into various blade actions. So we have transports, which put here. I just move Jacob to another line. In many cases, try it quite aggressively. These are, my experience, these are really, really cool after a parry. So if you just throw a cut, getting here and then transporting you to another line before a riposte is really, really cool because it can throw off your opponent, especially if your opponent's like planning on getting in and out very quickly, it can kind of throw off their recovery. And that's super cool. There is deviation, where I make a similar sort of idea as transport, but I make a very subtle movement. So I'm trying to just I'm trying to basically guide you off. Almost can't see that, but just get you not facing me. So
Just enough that it misses your torso.
yeah. Well, if we stand on guard pointing at each other, if you come forward, just boot me in the tit. I'm still there. Yeah. Whereas if you go back to guard, I make a very slight movement. Now coming again, you guide it off, and it's just a very, very small subtle movement, and it's really cool. And there's a whole variety of them in different hand positions. Again, it would be a whole video to go through all of them, but yeah, it's a cool thing. It's not something you see in many saber manuals, primarily because they expect you to learn it in foil. I think it's like there's a bunch of these that Hutton's just like, this is foil play, not saber play. But although he says that the reason he thinks that is because a saber is too heavy, whereas the Italians think you can do it because they're using much lighter sabers. There's those. There's a changement where I move, I disengage and move. So I'm actually using my disengage to move you before I come in. There is a beat where I whack you to the side. So this is a lateral movement where I just knock my opponent sideways. And then finally there is an effort, which is like a beat, except rather than going purely sideways, I actually want to go a little sideways and mostly forward to basically shear my opponent off. So making a movement where I'm coming down, and because I'm coming down along the line of the blade gets displaced off, which is like a beat but cooler. And yeah, these are all really cool. Again, a lot of options for setting things up. And a big part of, I think, where the system really shines is in it sets something up, it sets you up to do something really devastating. Like you just kind of get to the right distance, you make sure your opponent is seeing the wrong opening, you make sure that you move their sword a bit to just set them up, and then you just deliver a really powerful attack, which is cool. I think it works really well as an aggressive system. It was Hutton's main criticism of these was basically that they only work if your opponent has their blade out in positions where you can get access to them. Which, I mean, yes, like these are very, very reliant on these kinds of guards.
That's also probably why you instinctively thought of them as occurring after a parry.
Yeah.
Because that's when they end up there anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's the best time to do them. But yeah, there's an element where you can try and get your opponent into those positions, cut, or just making them change guards. Attacking the arm sometimes. Although we'll talk about arm attacks in a bit, but there's something really cool and interesting there. But yeah, it has blade actions. They are much more system specific than I think. Like I do agree that they're a bit more like system specific in a way that a lot of actual fencing that the British were doing at the time might not have been. But they're cool for what they are. And then you get into sort of basically renewed attacks. So you have what they call the re-attack, which I feel like at this point they're really trying to just change the terminology. Because like the term redouble is an English word that has been in the English fencing lexicon for, at that point, at least a century, and describes pretty much the same thing, except they're like, nope, it's the re-attack now. You attack and then you re-attack.
It's just where you yell re at someone while attacking them.
Not quite.
The pig squeal attack.
Yeah. Although this is going to be a nightmare to show in here. But you throw an attack, your opponent basically backs up. I'm trying to work out distance and something pretty well. This guard is very good for stop thrusting. But yeah, you throw the attack if your opponent then backs off, which I'm going to have to do because Jacob can't. You basically use, like, you actually pull your body back and that helps pull your leg up, which is really cool.
So you can fire it down the corridor.
Just go off camera.
Yeah.
So I throw, Jacob backs off out of distance. Put my body back to then use the counterweight to pull my leg up, which is hecking rad, and then just throw another attack. And that's cool. And it's a thing. And it's actually a really good use of the body shifting that is just, yeah, it's rad. I like it.
It's interesting because it's got almost a pendulum motion, which is pretty much what they say you shouldn't do in standard advancing footwork.
Yeah. I think it's because you're already on the forward lean. Cool. So, another question from Ed. So, further my previous query, was there something mentioned about having a shorter reach? So then, having to manage under their guard. Yep. So it's the thing I was going to bring up. But if your opponent has a shorter reach, Jacob definitely doesn't. Being under the guard gives you a bunch of options. And one thing I found fencing this is my arm was either incredibly well protected or incredibly vulnerable with no in between. So if you don't just come to him like normal medium guard and just stand very low. So if Jacob is low enough that I can't really form an engagement, I'm actually better in this position than I would be trying to do like a more normal guard. Like if you're like just on your knees or something low, like you're sort of so low that I can't get a proper engagement. From here, I'm in a lot of danger because Jacob's tip is very close to my arm. Whereas if I go here, I'm actually moving my sword further away, and this gives me a bit of
Closer to your face.
Yes.
Tip to get at your hand.
yeah. Also, the cool thing is I can defend, and if you do, I can do stuff I can defend by moving my hand and having a crack at yours. So yeah, if you can't form an engagement because your opponent's sword is too low, they're coming in under, then these guards are rad because they bring your hand quite high and keep it away, which works really, really well for me in some situations. If on the other hand, if you just come to your normal height, your normal medium guard, well, I've sort of got a bit of engagement, but not. I actually found from here, especially today fencing Cherie, I had to manage distance very, very well. Like I had to basically keep myself out of extension distance. So I came to like a normal Huttoning distance, I just get nailed in the arm because you can go up, you can just get underneath really quickly. And yeah, it's sort of, at that point I'm actually better bringing my hand down just so that it makes getting under my arm a bigger movement. But yeah, that's kind of I just thought that was cool. The one thing, although the next step of that is if you're at the height where you could hit me in the arm very easily, I can full extension. If I've got a sense you're going to do it, and I'm looking for it, and you have a crack, I can move into a circle cut and just, I can use that as a way of baiting you in.
Well, it does. You can see then why Hutton criticises the big elbow and shoulder cuts.
Yeah.
Because my instinct then would not be to stand there and do that. It would be, you're going for a circle cut.
Yes.
Dive in.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There's a huge timing aspect to it. Like if you're expecting me to circle cut, it's not going to work. But
And I think you're still better off doing all of these actions out of range.
oh yeah. Yeah. No, I think the distance. Yeah, again, the distance things just start further away and you're fine.
Which I guess kind of goes to the question of what would you do if you're a short person doing this system? Just have a bigger lunge?
I mean, you probably will by default. Just again, yes, athleticism required. You will have a big lunge.
Alternatively, go for the legs. You're not allowed to, but it'll be funny.
Yeah. Yeah, like, I mean, it's gonna, well, there's a bunch of stuff that you can't do. I mean, if you're shorter than me, actually, come with me to Xenia. Yeah, actually, no, I've got really good access to your arm from,
Yeah.
if I'm doing this back to you, I don't. Like, I can sort of thrust, but back in,
You're playing.
yeah, we're playing tipsies. So yeah, if I try and come over, you just do, well, you probably parry it and then you come back. Yeah, yeah, parry and come back. But yeah, no, it's definitely like, yeah, definitely a thing. Yeah, you probably want to emphasize sort of blade engagement a lot more, or just yeah, like yeah, definitely emphasize blade engagement. Probably direct attacks to the arm. Like
So the interesting thing is, I feel quite safe against this system if I'm doing Hutton, because all I do is, if I'm quite retracted, I have absolute control of the blade no matter what you do.
yeah,
You basically have to play to get around my blade.
yeah,
If I'm doing this, it's a lot more
Mm.
who's the better swordsman, who's got the better angle.
yeah. I mean
As a
that's
short person, I want to come in doing quite a retracted system. Just kind of
yeah, get control.
get into my distance.
I feel like you could do the same thing with the blade actions in this very easily though. So if we're here, like the whole like, you know, transport, beat kind of thing.
Yeah, they're all a lot riskier though. Like you said, your hand is either safe or it's not.
Yeah,
There's a lot, because there's like all those times there, yes, but if you do something wrong or I do something good, your hand's still a big target here. And again, we're just kind of playing hand sniping until someone gets too close.
yeah. Something
Whereas
someone
here,
gets that control.
You're not going to get my hand.
Yeah.
You're not really going to get my sword. I'm going to deny you everything.
Yeah, which I guess goes back to Hutton's comment of, well, if you just, your opponent can just deny it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly ways to make it work. I think it's more where you're going to run into issues, system asymmetry.
Yeah. Like I kind of think it is a fair point to make that I don't think this system is good for short people. Unless they have a really big lunge.
Yeah,
Given that all my default thoughts are stop doing this system and make them play a different game.
yeah,
And just because I do a lot more Hutton.
yeah. That's a big, yeah, this is the big thing we have to be mindful of is like, you don't want to bring too many biases to the system you're already doing. Like, we both do a lot of Hutton, so there's a lot of time, like, there's a lot of times where it took me ages to get things because I'm like, well, I just do a lot of Hutton and I want to do a Hutton thing. And then it's like, oh, but no, yeah. So, yeah, no, that's the thing. And the second final thing that pretty sure generated a bunch of controversy is the remiss. The remiss is, yeah, basically you make two attacks on the same lunge. So if I throw an attack, it doesn't land, I throw another attack. This was regarded as innately bad fencing in Britain right up until this point. And there's no acknowledgement of that in the manual. Like John Musgrave White has things that are technically remisses. He doesn't call them remisses in his manual. And he's very, very like this is a high skill, very circumstantial move. Hutton talks a lot about how remisses are innately bad fencing because if you just attack twice, best case scenario for you is that you double. But you know, there's also a fairly chance that your second attack won't land because your opponent will parry riposte you too well. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. That's just in there. It's just like, oh yeah, throw two attacks on the same lunge. It's a thing you can do, and there's no commentary on it. When yeah, a lot of the fencing thought at the time or leading up to this was, no, this is an innately bad thing to do. And this isn't to say that it's like definitely there are people who can pull off remisses or remises. I think in the 1895 it's much more anglicised than it normally is. Yeah, they're just like, yeah, you can do it. They're never like, hey, this is an advanced thing, or hey, this is a thing you need to set up by not, you know, because the way you get remisses to work normally is you work out what riposte your opponent is most likely to do and countercut it. So you know, if I know that if I throw here, Jacob's most likely going to come at me with like a cut number 7, straight down. And I feel like, all right, I'm going to throw a cut. I'm going to quickly come the other way and counter cut that. That's how Wade says to do it, and that's how I've seen it done. But yeah, there's no discussion of this in the manual. And I don't know, like,
What you did when you first demonstrated it was a slight beat to ensure you had room to do it safely.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's stuff you can do, but it is a very, very high risk thing that a number of fencing masters at the time would have just said, just don't do that, bad fencing. But really after the standard scoring system in Britain, if there was a double, the point went to whoever was on the lunge or had been the aggressor, unless it was their second cut on that lunge, in which case it went to the defender because they wanted to encourage people to be aggressive to come forward, but they wanted to discourage them from throwing multiple attacks. They wanted them to do attack, defend, have that kind of pace into it, which is kind of like a proto version of modern fencing priority rules. And then the final thing it deals with is timing your opponent. So just how to use the techniques that's already established to either take advantage of the fact that you know when your opponent's going to go, or take advantage of the fact that your opponent has made a mistake. So it's timing, where if Jacob just lifts their hand up, I can time thrust them to mistake. If I know that if Jacob's attacking on a rhythm, or I have a sense of when Jacob's timing is, and I know when Jacob is going to say throw a circle cut, big circle cut, I can come straight forward and just intercept them. But you can also play with that where Jacob might attack on a rhythm so that I try, and then take advantage of me trying to counter time. There's this whole meta of there's this whole distance and timing meta that they never explain the timing initiative aspect of it, which is honestly quite abstract and quite difficult. Like even now you mostly learn it through drills rather than through description of it. But yeah, it's there, it's cool. It's kind of interesting that at the back of the manual there's a whole bunch of really advanced fencing when this isn't necessarily thought of as an advanced or complex fencing system. So that's the entire system in very short summary that took me probably about an hour to get through. So hope that gives you a sense of what the system is like. Let's move on to some of the criticisms we haven't covered already. There was a few. The interesting one, all of the ones Hutton says is
To interrupt, I do highly recommend people read Hutton's criticisms, because a lot of them are very fucking silly, but they are very funny.
Yes.
It's an amusing read.
It is. There's a bunch of legit stuff in there.
There are a lot of very good critiques as well.
Yeah, it's
just obviously when you get the ones that jump out to you.
The times he's kind of nitpicking a bit because, again, he had a bit of a personal grievance in this. But yeah, I think reading through the criticisms is also quite useful for for understanding understanding how to do this system better, seeing what its weaknesses are. So a lot of cases, the criticism, the very legit criticisms are not an indictment of the system so much as just expressing what a weakness it has. Are you reading some of that?
I was going to find the ultimate internet troll language.
Oh,
I have to find it.
yeah. Well, we've got some questions, so you've got a moment. Smickos, what do you think is better suited to military? Do you think it's better suited to military than Hutton? Bearing in mind that military have limited training time available. I'm not a military historian. I've never been in the military. I only really go off what the sources say. So this is not a terribly educated opinion, but I'm mostly here to be entertaining anyway, so if I say something stupid and wrong, at least it'll be funny. Honestly, I don't know. I can
It's so diplomatic.
what?
He's such a historian. I think Hutton's system is better for military.
Okay. I disagree with actually something I forgot to bring up before. So I tried battling with this against a few different weapons last that day, and I got to try it out against rapier and against sword and buckler. And against rapier, I had a lot more success than I did against than I normally do using Hutton. Against sword and buckler, I got destroyed. Mick wanted to express gratitude.
And to be fair, that was me being less democratic was partially informed by seeing you fight against sword and buckler and seeing the system collapse.
Against sword and buckler, it's not a very good system.
Which, if you're the English army,
To the British Army in 1890, this was in 1896, 1890, actually it would have been 1898. There was an article published in the United Services Journal by, I wrote his name down because I'm horrible with names, Colonel Valens Cosgrove Tonachi. And that's one of the things he says is the system doesn't work very effectively against opponents armed with sword and buckler. Grab a buckler.
I could see this system being a lot better for dueling than Hutton.
Well, that's one of the things Hutton says is I think it does have another application, one instance where it is better than Hutton that is a military application, which I'll get to in a minute. Yeah, so from here, I mean, if you want to go for my leg, you can cover with your buckler. And I have no idea what to do. And apparently that was a thing that was very popular in India, is you cover with your buckler and swipe at the leg. And yeah, if you don't have any leg defense, like if you're not taught how to defend the leg at all, kind of vulnerability. The other thing is if we actually get contact, like if I'm trying to get some kind of sword control, you can just use your buckler. You can use your buckler to get sword control, just pull your sword the heck out of the way. And yeah, not great for me. So it's not a great system against sword and buckler.
Which is basically, if you're fighting a single sword against sword and buckler, you just need to deny them any contact with your sword.
Yeah.
As often as possible.
Yeah.
Which,
Yeah.
any extended system is going to struggle with.
Yeah. And to be fair, sword and buckler hadn't really been used in Italy for centuries at that point. And to my knowledge, Italy didn't actually have a historical fencing movement the way certainly Britain, like Hutton was, British Victorian Rahima, but also France had, and honestly, a much more developed historical fencing scene in Britain. At the time, but yeah, like the Italians, not so much. Never really got into the whole reviving historical weapons. They did apparently use Renaissance era rapier manuals as part of their literature. Like you actually read classical text to learn how to fence. And so there's a much greater consistency in Italian technical language and technical fencing, or Italian fencing generally, which I think is why they never thought to do a full revival, because they didn't feel like their tradition had died. But yeah, wouldn't have fought sword and buckler at that time. One thing I do think it is better at is actually dealing with bayonet. And there are multiple reasons for this. One is that Hutton's advice on dealing with a bayonet is basically boils down to be a better fencer. Like everything he says works, requires you to have a better sense of timing and distance. And he says, if you can't get that, then you're pretty much screwed. And fair is fair. Hutton, there are multiple accounts of Hutton just demolishing an opponent, using a sabre to demolish opponents with a bayonet. He also beat bayonet armed opponents with a foil. There's multiple accounts of people just doing the classical three foil, sabre, bayonet of the period, and just basically cut and saying, all right, well, I'm just going to use this weapon for a bit, just pick whatever weapon you want, and then just destroying them. But at the same time, if you're saying the same skill level as your opponent, the advice that boils down to get good is not helpful.
It's interesting though, because I would have thought a retracted system would be better against bayonet.
God no, fuck no. I'm bayoneting. If you're just even a retracted thing, you've now given. It's very, very easy for me to switch lines. And I can just come at you on any line. And this is the thing Hutton says is a big problem with bayonet, is the tip moves really quick. Which, if you've got initiative and you're picking when the attack is going to happen, it's fine if you've got superior timing distance. But if all things equal, not only if I get any control of initiative, you're basically fucked. Also, because I've got a longer, faster weapon, it's much, much easier for me to get control of that timing initiative. And yeah, you've got to parry in one of four locations, and you have to choose basically have to hope I don't faint. Like I've tried this, and it's not fun. I mean, it's not fun when you've got the saving. It's like you get a parry, and you're just like, oh, victory! I finally parried one of the several hits that have been nailed. Apparently, if you go to, or do you want to switch over there on purpose, or do you want to just try it out?
I'll switch.
Yeah. Actually, give me a shoulder. Let's definitely switch. Here, I've got a fair degree of contact, and so if you go low, it's very easy for me to follow you. And I can very easily defend with a much smaller motion. And this is actually the good.
We have to play with this because you also have no leverage.
Yeah, okay. Once you get to a full arm extended out, it's fine.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's like, yeah, anything. If you try and play with my sword, just walk forward.
Yeah.
My arm, because I've got my arm fully extended and braced. I've actually got a lot of leverage and resistance that way. And yeah, like this is, I mean, the good anti-bayonet advice from the 1880s, like Waite's advice is basically you just use prime or second. So you engage like this. If they're there, you just go to second, and it honestly doesn't matter. It does, if their tip is down there, it doesn't really matter what they're doing, but just go there and catch them. And if the tip is above yours, go to prime and just walk at them. Although his advice is to grab. But yeah, these parries I think actually would work better against the bayonet than these, your sort of traditional Hutton parries.
I think of a reason they wouldn't.
Yeah.
Parry. Step in.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, because as soon as you lose pressure, I'm straight in your face. And if you've played a lot of those point pressure games, you're very used to that. Like if you've done this as a sword where you're so used to it, where if your opponent moves away from you, you just go straight in. You just go to nail them. Yeah. No, I think and I do think that there is a degree to where even if Masiello is saying his system is primarily sportive, it still comes out of a tradition of a country and out of a martial culture that has been fighting wars purely with other European powers. So, your expectations are you're going to face either another person with a sword, a person with a sword on horseback, or you're on foot, or you're on, or vice versa, or someone with a bayonet when you've got a sword. So your infantry system basically needs to deal with that, needs to be able to deal with another sword and a bayonet. Whereas for Britain, where they've been finding people with swords and bucklers, or tire-hars, or iquars and big hide shields, like all sorts of things, they need a very different fencing system. This is also this is why Hutton included a lot of grappling, as a reaction to the article in the United Service magazine. Not only did it condemn really heavily criticize the 1895, it also really praised Hutton as having a much better system for practical fencing. But it also said that grappling was little bit of advice Hutton had given on grappling was really helpful. So Hutton then wrote an article on how to teach someone to grapple with a sword in more detail, and then in the 1898 edition of the Swordsman, the second edition, it included an appendices that actually described how to grapple in a sword fight because of that article. But yeah, in terms of my actual opinion is if you're facing someone with a long stabby weapon like a spear or a bayonet, I actually do think the 1895 is a better system for dealing with that. If you're facing someone with a sword and buckler, and I suspect it'd be the same for a two-handed weapon, like a longsword or something like that, especially as long as they get leverage on you, you'd actually be better off using Hutton's system. For sword on sword, they're basically equal. People will talk about how Italians were much more reputable, were known to be the best sabre fencers, certainly in Europe at the time, and certainly, much better reputation than the British. But most sources are also very specific about why that is, and it's not from the technique.
Yeah, I might say that sword on sword if you're quite fit and strong,
Mm.
this system is quite powerful.
Oh, yeah.
If you're not, I would prefer Hutton.
Yeah, and it's like, oh yeah, it's a thing that if you're very athletic, like say you've been supplementing this with gymnastic training, which was actually how the system was deployed, super powerful. And that's actually a thing. Apparently, the Italians really got into fitness, or like a big fitness component to the physical training. They also had a National Academy training instructors, and this is the thing Hutton says is the Italians are really good because they've got a National Academy that's training really good high quality instructors and high quality coaches. But yeah, and you can kind of see that as well in the fact that adopting Italian technique without any of the social institutions that were present in Italy didn't actually fix the problems with British fencing so much. Like there's still, civilian fencing certainly, it was certainly moved away from the system after a while, and went back to sort of the more traditional British and French fencing, like derived fencing systems. Whereas the Italians continue to be, and continue even today, one of the great fencing nations because they had those social institutions and social support. And it isn't to say the techniques are any worse, just like they're really good. It is a really good system, especially if you're a really powerful athlete. It's just that's not what gave Italian fencers in the period their advantage. It was the fact that they had better pedagogy and better instructors, and also better physical training. So.
It's interesting that in terms of weapon combinations, it's a really good system when you want to control them, when you want contact with the opponent, and it's a really bad system when you don't want contact with the opponent.
Yeah,
Which is why it works good against bayonet. Because you desperately need to control it, and they desperately want to just keep you from touching their bayonet ever.
Yeah.
And then really bad against buckler because all they want is please touch your sword on my buckler.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's interesting.
It makes me think that if you were bayonet fighting against it, just keeping distance by making them have to reach down to go for it.
Yeah, probably.
It's a weird way to fight, though.
Yeah, well, actually, there's a bayonet system for that where it has what it describes as the anti-sword guard, which, if I don't fun on, is that. Your tip is all the way out here. I face off against Jacob. You'd see my tip is well in front. And I think part of that is just to be able to come in at the leg, but also to deny that contact.
Yeah. It'd be great if you had a gauntlet. Because all I'm seeing is slipping out of the hand.
Yeah. Which in a larger room might be a bit more difficult.
Yeah.
Again, distance control. Yeah, so that's, kind of interesting. Alright, so I feel like there are other criticisms that we've missed. So let's see. Optimize for duel. So actually, this is the thing. Hutton says that Italian sabre fencing is for dueling. He says it's all very optimized for duel, and the Italians are absolutely excellent at that. But that's not what British soldiers need their sword for, because in Britain the duel is dead, which is true. Britain. The last sword duel in Britain was in 1796, so nearly 100 years prior. Also, it was between two women, interestingly enough, as a bit of trivia for you. But yeah, so that's his criticism. It's okay, I think it kind of ignores how much of British fencing was sportive and was built around trying stuff out against a resisting opponent, as opposed to they were developing new things in fencing cells and through essentially scenario training like we do today, rather than basing on the survivors who are coming back from combat necessarily. Actual combat accounts played a very secondary role. Really, actually, at the time, the only nation that really put a lot of stock in evidence-based practice was France. But at the same time, doing stuff, training in a variety of situations against a resisting opponent is just one of the most powerful ways to train. So you can't really fault them too much.
Yeah, it's a bit like saying I could take on an MMA fighter that never been in a real fight in their life. Good luck with that one.
Yeah, no, Everyone sometimes just trained a lot of MMA is going to have a huge advantage over fighting with someone who hasn't.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what's some of the criticisms? I mean, there's the thing about like not the legs just not being tight, just having absolutely no defense for it. And if you've gone through this video and you're like, hey, the system's cool, I want to do it. Definitely, like that is still a definite weakness. In a modern HEMA context, where legs often are a target, either in free play or most HEMA tournament rules, legs are a target. Not all, and there's some really cool like historical rules tournaments getting going in Melbourne. We're actually using period rule sets or refined period rule sets where it gets rid of all the weird ambiguities that came from the fact that these rules are actually quite experimental, and they don't target legs, and those are red as heck. But yeah, in a lot of context, leg attacks are a thing. There are solutions. I mean, my recommendation, even as a Huttonist, if you're doing 1895 and you need a leg defense, go and look at earlier Rodelli fencing from Italy, like get some translations that talks about how to defend your legs, because it's much, much easier to integrate than it is to integrate things from British fencing. The stance is different, the sensibility and like the movement vocabulary is really different.
This might also be one place where a shorter fencer with less, well, especially a shorter fencer might have an easier time. It's without having to add anything to the system. I can defend my legs with this system because I'm quite comfortable squatting this low in the middle of a fight.
Yeah. I kind of get freaking down there, so yeah. There's plenty like I've been to seminars with Rodelli fences. A big part of why I did this is because there's not a lot of videos of Italian sabre, and there's a lot of resources necessarily, but not a lot of videos, and I prefer videos as a resource. But yeah, I've seen stuff where you just parry really low, or it's even one where you step all the way back and bring your sword down, and then just launch yourself back at your person, and it's rad. So yeah, there's definitely that's kind of how to overcome that weakness if you're inspired, which is really on that do a lot of. I mean, you should do a lot of
squats.
Yeah. Probably work out, like just get a gym membership, which you should be doing anyway. Like I know the whole injury thing that you see come up in here, like particularly with the arm. It's like, oh, it's a tennis elbow. That got mitigated in the period by gymnastic exercise, by just having like an exercise regime outside of fencing. And I think that's a good reason to have a bit of like at least a little bit of physical training in fencing training. Even if you're like a massive nerd who uses the term sports ball unironically, still helpful. Kettlebells are great. Indian clubs are fantastic. Most gyms have, honestly, if I had to pick a modern thing that would probably be best in terms of rehabbing and preventing injury, Pilates, or possibly also probably yoga. I find yoga classes are can be a bit hit and miss, probably because they're a lot more common and a lot less regulated. But yeah, they would definitely do some physical training. But on that, have a living.
Swimming.
Mm.
Really good for shoulders, especially.
Yeah.
You use all the shoulder muscles.
Yeah, having no resistance. But yeah, on that, like if you need to defend the leg and you refuse to read any other manual, I mean, if you want to do the system in the 1895. If you want to do it well, you at the very least read Francis Wright's translation of Masiello's work because it explains a bunch of things in much better detail. It explains a bunch of things much better. Like a lot of the wording problems up with this system are legit. But even then, like I was saying, the jump, and just doing that is actually pretty good leg defense. Just getting the heck out. I got that to work out in today, which I was glad for because I got nailed in the leg a few times before then.
If you kind of integrate the jump and the reverse lunge as well, that angling of your body forward and legs back is kind of like a slip but more secure. So you can kind of hop back into that. That would be quite dangerous to try and attack the legs against.
That is also, it's also one of my staple leg defenses because I've had people who got very, very determined to hit me in the leg, and so I had to get very, very determined to not hit them. That can work as well. Like, there's a lot of stuff that you can integrate in, and it doesn't take a lot. Like, I don't know. I think all the systems were like the system doesn't really like. It's very, very easy to solve the one major weakness, which is that it doesn't deal with leg attack or defense at all. So if you like the system and you're just like, and you worry about your legs, it doesn't really take much to resolve that. If you did, if that's a path you want to go down. But yeah, it is just in the period. If you're taking purely the system itself, that is a weakness. The other one that was really interesting. Well, there's a few more comments that were really interesting. One complaint, this was Hutton comments that Cyril Mathey, who Cyril Mathey did, said that the system doesn't make any use of the false edge. So there's no use of the back edge, which, interesting enough, Hutton is credited, one of the things Hutton's credited for, amongst a myriad of things, was bringing back false edge play, which he specifically says he got from Italian fencing. And yeah, it's really funny that a British system that is wholesale adopting Italian fencing doesn't include it. Yeah.
Nick approves of our leg defense.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yes. Thank you, Nick. I'm glad you approve. No, it's a good defense. The other one that's super interesting that Hutton says is it's not good for kids. And the reason he says is the blows are way too powerful to be reasonably trained. And he basically says if kids get hurt during training, they're not going to want to fence. This is one thing we don't really discuss we don't discuss pedagogy enough in HEMA. We tend to fixate on technique. And so what I'm saying before, what made the medallionists earn their reputation as great sabreurs was that pedagogy, was the fact that they had the best coaches. And so Hutton's very, very interested in how to teach people effectively. And he actually comes up with a lot of very innovative teaching practices. But he talks a lot about how to train kids, and he says if they get hurt, if they get scared, if they get hit too hard, they're not going to want to train. They're not going to want to fence because it means that fencing is super fun, especially when you're a kid. Bring boffers to a family gathering and see how much fun nephews and nieces and siblings have.
Can confirm, I am a child.
I think we're all just very, very big. We're just very aged children, really. But yeah, no, it's I've actually gone to friends, sword friends kind of park gatherings and and been the only person who brought boffers for some reason. And even then, me and my sword friends will not end up fencing because the kids do. But yeah, what Hutton says is basically the really hard blows are going to deter kids, so it's not a good method for teaching kids, which actually is a really substantive concern because in the period there was a big push to get kids to do military drill, particularly in we call them private schools. They get called public schools in Britain because whatever reason. But yeah, because the idea was that people would go from these elite private schools into the military, and giving them a background in military drill before going to the military was really, really helpful. Which is why a lot of GPS schools in Australia, your elite private schools, have cadet corps, and that's a tradition that goes all the way back to the Victorian period. But yeah, so that's one of his criticisms, which I kind of actually do agree with.
I wouldn't want to take a full arm swing with a single stick.
Yeah, I wouldn't want kids doing it. There's actually that in contrast to this, one thing that newspapers said of the Italian fencers who came to Britain is they could safely fence wearing just a standard fencing jacket, like a standard foil jacket, so no padding, mask and glove, and they were fine. Whereas the British needed all of this padding to basically wail on each other with single sticks. And yeah, if you're super athletic and have really good weapon control, and particularly doing a system that develops really good weapon control, and you maybe have really good coaches who can facilitate that, dead set, you can do freaking big smashy cuts and hit with the lightest tap. Plenty of even one practitioners are like that. With kids are notorious for having poor motor control, and yeah, you
get the one athletic kid in your class, and suddenly you've got 5 broken arms.
Yeah. or you get one kid who gets frustrated and starts swinging hard. And when that's part of the system, it's quite hard to turn around and say, no, don't do that. Like, it's quite hard to sort of just move it and intervene. Whereas, yeah, it's just, you know, your cuts are quick, you know, slashy things that just, you know, take fine motor skills to make powerful. It's fine. Whereas, yeah, something like this, not so great. And this was actually a really major concern at the time because they were getting kids to do military drill. Which, yes, I just, because I did my honors thesis on Victorian militarism. Well, actually, technically, on Hutton's place in Victorian militarism. Yeah, that stuff interests me. But the other one, the final criticism Hutton gives, and this is probably really pertinent to my points about training, is he says that from what he's heard, because the systems, there's so much material and there's so little time to train it, no one's actually going to fence. What they're going to do is they're just going to do the drills, and even on the parade ground, they're just going to come and do basically compliant partner exercises for the whole time they're fencing, or the whole time they're learning like soldiers learning to sword fight. They're not actually going to fence with each other, and according to Hutton, he seemed very concerned that they might not fence with each other at all, which, yeah, from a pedagogical perspective, or like from a learning defense perspective, you need to fence to learn defense. Like a big thing, this is actually something Hutton does talk about with the Italians. He says they're really into fencing and they do it like heaps. Like they're just practicing all the time, and that's what's made them really good fencers. But within that, they're putting in more hours so they can do these really complicated systems and then go out and try them out in fencing and get all this really cool, interesting stuff to work. Whereas if all you're doing is the drills, if you've never done it against a resisting opponent in a safe situation, it's going to be a lot harder to do it against a resisting opponent in a dangerous situation. And so yeah, that's kind of that's sort of the other criticism that he makes, and I do think that one is legitimate. Like, I from the perspective of a modern practitioner, not so much, because HEMA is built around competitive bouting against a resisting opponent. But yeah, in the period, if you have to choose between a more complicated system or like a more detailed system, or a system with more that offers you more options but doesn't bout, and one that has fewer options but does give you, like 50% of your training time is spent just fencing. The one where you're actually bouting is probably the better option. Well, I should say this is the one definitive statement I made. The better option. Yes, to learn defense, you need to fence to learn defense. Yeah, so that was that's kind of the whole system. Not all of the criticisms, but like a lot of the criticisms are petty as heck. Like Cyril Mathey, one of the things he takes massive umbrage with and writes in red pen, big red letters, is that the sword is held, not grasped, because in the 1895, with their refusal to use any existing terminology, they refer to your grip as grasping the sword rather than holding the sword. And it's like internet pettiness.
Yeah. There was a wonderful quote I had that gave a sense of the pettiness, which was when he could have said, this won't work reliably every time, he wrote, which is not likely to be a complete success until he has contrived to alter the laws of nature and to abolish entirely the gravitation of atoms towards the center of the earth. Thanks, Hartman. There's a lot of internet pettiness going on.
Oh, yeah. And to be clear, it's not just Hutton. This is an animosity. Well, in Hutton's case, this was an animosity that built up over years with Colonel Fox. So in 1892, Hutton gave a presentation to a committee of British top military brass about sword fighting, and he talked a bit about what he thought what was going on, or what he's seen coming out of the military, and he then says, and this is what I think should be done about it. And Fox basically sent a letter to be read out to that, attacking Hutton and quite nitpicking. One of the things Hutton points out is that he really tried to knock down Hutton's idea of promoting fencing in schools, which is something that Hutton had been doing for a little while and had started to see success with. And yeah, and then Hutton kind of points out, well, the dude who wrote that letter also ran like a youth competition, like a competition for kids the same age. So obviously can't think it's that bad an idea. Yeah, there's a lot of pettiness on both ends. You actually, because one of the when you see like Fox talk about this, similarly, like these are all like British imperialists, very, very, very cis, very, very manly, and yeah, not very able to constructively criticize each other. And yeah, like there's one where there was an article published in the Irish Times about the new system that also said that the leaning lunge is this great innovation that's come in not just in Britain but also in France. And Hutton, living in Britain and therefore not knowing the latest trends in French fencing, wrote a letter to Jonesville, to the French, where the French military fencing, the centre of like the French school of fencing was. In French, he actually translated the article as well and said, "Can you confirm that they're now leaning on the lunge?" He asked a bunch of questions, and of course, so with Hutton being quite high profile and the whole discussion being quite high profile, the French at Jonesville wrote a nice letter back that they actually that they ended up getting published, I think, where they said, "Yeah, look, this is," or what they said is, "Look, you're best off asking Mr. Roux, who is the best fencing instructor in France, this directly." And Mr. Roux then wrote a letter back saying, "Yep," basically saying, "Yeah, look, I've been teaching the leaning lunge for a while now. It's a thing." He made a bunch of other notes, like he said that the article seemed to confuse foil or what is meant by sword, where he said they seem to mean sabre, whereas in France, like sabre, when we say sword, we mean épée. And yeah, but very polite, very kind of, sort of commentary on this piece, like, yeah, actually we have started doing the leaning lunge here. That is a change in practice. And I suspect that might have also been when Hutton kind of dropped a bunch of objections to leaning lunges because, the best master in France was doing it, and France was one of the two great fencing nations at the time. But then there's also a report shortly after there was a visit to Jonesville by Colonel Fox, and he was very snarkily complaining, going, "Oh, did Hutton translate the entire article or just some of it?" And can you tell Captain Hutton this and this and this? It's very, very kind of, well, go tell him this. And I get the impression the French are just like, okay, we're just going to get out of this one because there's something going on here. But yeah, like a lot of snark on both ends, like very internet comment drama, which I just think was amazing. It's like the more things change, the more they say the same. It's just and when we're talking about letters to the editor, a lot of cases people using letters to newspapers to find things out that now you go on like a Facebook group or you'd ask on like a HEMA Discord about what's the deal with this system, how are people in this place doing this thing, whereas people used to write into newspapers and newspapers would actually pass letters on or would actually go and find out for them, which I don't think of it like even when newspapers were like pre-internet, before newspapers were a thing. I don't think that was happening with letters to the editor, so that's something that got lost in the 20th century, but seems really common in the 19th. So that's kind of the general presentation. If there are any, I don't know, unless do you have comments? No? Yeah. Okay, cool. If anyone has any further questions, comments, conundrums, combinations, clarifications, like I said, this is not the system I primarily do. I've been working on this for probably like a month and a half. And like I guarantee if I look over the footage, I will see things I got wrong. So, if you are a person who does, like, if you know, like, Redelius fencing, which is the school that Masiello sabre comes from, more than happy to be corrected. Make a response video even. More videos on this out there is always going to be helpful, and particularly building sabre within the HEMA community. So, cool. So I should probably give people a chance to type by saying shit. So,
Wrangle. It's your superpower. No pressure.
All right. So I've got a comment from Nick. He said, "Enjoyed it. Thanks for doing it." Oh, my pleasure. Really enjoyed it as well. So I had fun. And really been having fun researching this. Like, it's been kind of nice to really engage with the history as well. So, yeah, kind of got those things out, which is good. Yeah, on that, yeah, that's pretty much my thing. I don't know. Yeah, hopefully inspired some people to take more interest in the system. Kind of a thing that I really want to do is actually talk about standard military systems, because there's a lot of, even within modern contemporary HEMA, the way we think of things is always built around the manuals that are being practiced. So you ask someone about like what is British military sabre in the 19th century, they will give you a copy of Cold Steel or broadsword and single stick practice, or something like that. And as much as like Hutton and Waite were both very reputable and they're very, very heavily referenced, in a lot of sources, they're not necessarily, their systems were not standard in the military. Particularly Hutton did train certain regiments, like he was a military sword instructor for pretty much his entire adult life in one way or another, but his systems were never standard. Whereas Tui's system was standard and it was very simple, which is why I did a previous video on it. The 1895 was the standard military manual, and this is the manual that most people were expected to learn from. And yeah, I kind of also want to promote this one just to think it's a more detailed and better system, whereas you do like the standard things like Tui, or even Henry Angelo the Younger's Infantry Sword Exercise. There's not a lot to them, and I think that's part of why they don't get enough coverage within, or enough interest within the contemporary HEMA communities. If you're wanting to do more than dabble in sabre, you probably want something with a bit more material, a bit more depth, and so you have a Wade or Hutton.
It's possibly why the stereotype of English fencing of English sabre fencing in particular is that it's very it's simplified or wrong continental fencing.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that's the case, just because like there's no historiographical evidence that British sabre is derived from the continental system. Foil in Britain was very much French foil, to the extent where even people we know who never learnt directly from a French master, like Hutton never learnt directly from a French master, but he's still following French trends and French changes quite enthusiastically. But yeah, sabre, not so much, still very much a domestic British thing. And that's, yeah, well, in terms of contemporary comments, that's where those comments come from. Like a lot of discussion of the problems of British, or the limitations of British sabre, really do come from the fact that the systems they were doing were very, very simplistic. And also that there just wasn't a lot of interest. Like Hutton actually says in his response to the 1895 that where he's just like, yeah, there are all 4 professional and qualified instructors in Britain at the time. He doesn't. It's a bit of a humble brag because one of those instructors is him. Although it's weird, in spite of like this massive clash of personalities, Hutton actually doesn't toot his own horn very much. It's a weird one, but yeah. Anyway, but yeah, like that's probably, I think, has a lot to it, and also the lack of depth within British systems. Yeah. So Kierak's got a comment. Interesting. Really sounds like a clash of personalities. Yep. It is, but it's also a clash of projects. So Hutton first kind of wanted to develop military fencing. Like his first effort to that was the publication of Cold Steel in 1889, which is the same year that Francis Vere Wright's translation of Masiello's manual comes out, which of course meant that they were both initiatives were starting at the same time. So and then of course neither was in communication with each other, and then Hutton comes in, and then Fox has to deal with the fact that all of a sudden one of the most reputable fencers in Britain is trying to do the same thing he's trying to do, and he has competition. So I think that might have fueled the clash of personalities a bit. There's no evidence of contact between the two men prior to 1892. They probably knew each other through reputation more than interaction. But yeah, there was this thing where Colonel Fox had already started trying to develop Masiello as a standard method for the British military. Hutton was trying to basically develop his own method based on an upgraded and reinvigorated British broadsword system. And the two men were automatically at odds, and then neither really had the sort of personality to work around that. So yeah, bit of complexity, but also kind of interesting. Yeah. Cool. So if that's it, we might leave it here. I have to know the comments. I know this horrible feeling I want go check the Facebook or something. And then discover that like people be trying to be like, oh, you're wrong about this, wrong about this. So yeah, we'll see how we go. So if you want to learn a similar system, there is again a seminar on it in Melbourne in a bit over a week. So I'm just going to post a link to that to the chat. So if you're in Melbourne or can travel to Melbourne, definitely check it out. Nelson, who's running it, is a really, really amazing fencer. Highly recommend. And also, if you want a good sense of what these systems are like from someone who's done them for more than like 5 or 6 weeks, definitely very good. But unfortunately, in person, so not great for everyone. But yeah, other than that, I'll be back with more streams soon. I don't know what I'm doing next. I need to work that out. I was planning to work that out today, and then I didn't. But yeah, I will catch you all about. Oh yeah, and if you're in Sydney and want to do physical classes, I do classes in Hutton Sabre. Currently also Hutton's Longsword in Erskineville, and we meet up once a month in Haberfield Park to do some fencing. So yeah, have fun. Hope you enjoyed the stream. Like, share, and subscribe, because I think I meant to say that or something in the YouTube terms of service. And yeah,